A billionaire in a hurry booked an Uber, only to be shocked when he saw his ex-wife driving with a 6-7-year-old sitting beside her. A great story for my beautiful family. God bless you all. Let's start the story. Money can buy you everything except time, and today, Chris Rose was running out of both. The mahogany desk trembled under the force of Chris Rose's clenched fist as he stared at the crimson numbers bleeding across his computer screen. $47 million, gone, evaporated like morning mist under the scorching sun of a market crash that had blindsided even the most seasoned wolves of Wall Street. His empire, built brick by brick over 15 grueling years, now teetered on the precipice of absolute destruction. The phone buzzed with the persistence of a dying wasp. Another creditor, another vulture circling the carcass of what was once the most feared investment firm on the East Coast. Chris ignored it, his steel-grey eyes fixed on the reflection staring back from his monitor. At 38, he looked older. The stress had carved premature lines around his eyes, and his once perfect jaw now carried the weight of decisions that had cost him everything he'd ever held dear. Mr. Rose. His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, tinged with the kind of fear that only comes when paychecks are uncertain. The Japanese investors are here. Conference room 3. Chris straightened his Italian silk tie, a habit that had carried him through countless boardroom battles. Today felt different. Today felt final. The Yamamoto Group represented his last hope, a $20 billion lifeline that could resurrect his company from the grave. But they were notoriously punctual, and he was already running late. His driver had cancelled 30 minutes ago. Food poisoning, the man claimed, though Chris suspected the real illness was the unpaid wages from the past 2 months. The parking garage elevator was broken, and his Lamborghini sat trapped 4 floors below like a caged predator. In the distance, storm clouds gathered over Manhattan, painting the sky the color of old blood. "Damn it all to hell," Chris muttered, grabbing his phone and opening the Uber app. The irony wasn't lost on him. A billionaire reduced to riding in strangers' cars. But pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. The app showed a driver 2 minutes away. Perfect. He grabbed his briefcase, the leather worn smooth by years of carrying documents worth more than most people's homes, and headed for the elevator. Each step echoed in the empty hallway like a countdown to Judgment Day. Outside, the October wind carried the scent of impending rain and dying leaves. New York City moved around him with its usual indifferent rhythm, millions of souls pursuing their own desperate dreams, unaware that one of their titans was about to fall from grace. Chris remembered when he'd first arrived in this concrete jungle 15 years ago, young, hungry, and stupid enough to believe that success was simply a matter of wanting it badly enough. He'd been right to a point. Success had come. Money had flowed like water through his fingers. But somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten that what goes up can come down just as quickly. The market had taught him humility the hard way, stripping away his arrogance layer by layer until only the raw core remained. His phone vibrated. The Uber was approaching, a silver Honda Civic that looked like it had seen better decades. Chris felt a stab of embarrassment. 6 months ago, he wouldn't have been caught dead in such a vehicle. Now it represented salvation. The memories came unbidden as he waited. Asha's face radiant on their wedding day, her laughter echoing through their penthouse apartment. The way she'd looked at him with such love, such hope, such faith in their future together. And then the fights, the accusations, the lawyers, the papers signed with trembling hands and hearts full of regret. 7 years. 7 years since he'd seen her face, heard her voice, felt the weight of what he'd thrown away. The divorce had been a battlefield, casualties scattered in every direction. She'd wanted to talk, to explain something important, but he'd been too proud, too angry, too convinced that he was the victim in their tragic story. Now, standing on the sidewalk with his empire crumbling around him, Chris wondered if karma was finally collecting her debt. The Honda pulled up to the curb, exhaust pipe coughing like an old man with too many cigarettes in his past. Through the windshield, he could see the driver's silhouette, petite frame, hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Chris opened the passenger door, sliding into the worn fabric seat that smelled of air freshener and something else, something familiar that made his heart skip a beat. He looked up, ready to give the address, and found himself staring into a pair of dark brown eyes he'd once known better than his own. "Hello." "Chris," Usher Williams said, her voice carrying 7 years of hurt wrapped in forced politeness. Time stopped. The city sounds faded to white noise. His briefcase slipped from nerveless fingers, landing on the floor with a dull thud that seemed to echo in the sudden silence between them. She was older, yes, but still beautiful in that effortless way that had first captured his attention at a charity gala that now felt like a lifetime ago. Her skin still held that warm glow, her lips still curved in that same cautious smile that had once made him believe in happy endings. But there was something else in the car, a presence that made Chris turn his head slowly, as if moving through thick honey. In the back seat, wrapped in a blanket too large for his small frame, sat a boy. 7 years old, maybe 8, skin the color of café au lait, hair that curled at the edges, just like Chris's had when he was young. But it was the eyes that stole his breath away, his own eyes, the same steel grey that had stared back at him from mirrors his entire life. The boy looked sick, pale, fragile. Dark circles shadowed those familiar eyes, and his breathing seemed labored, as if each inhale was a conscious effort. He clutched a small, stuffed elephant to his chest, the toy worn smooth by countless nights of comfort. "Mama," the child whispered, his voice barely audible over the car's struggling engine. "I'm tired." Asha's hands tightened on the steering wheel until her knuckles went white. She didn't look at Chris, didn't acknowledge the recognition that passed between them like an electric current. Instead, she put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, merging into traffic with the practiced ease of someone who'd been doing this job for longer than pride would have preferred. "Where to?" she asked, her tone professional, distant, as if she were speaking to just another passenger instead of the man who'd once promised her forever. Chris couldn't speak. His mind reeled, processing impossibilities, calculating dates, adding up clues that pointed to a truth he wasn't ready to face. The boy in the back seat looked at him with curious eyes, innocent and trusting in the way that only children could be. There was no accusation there, no judgment, just a sick little boy looking at a stranger who happened to share his face. "The Meridian Building," Chris finally managed, his voice hoarse. "And downtown." Asher nodded and adjusted the rearview mirror. For a moment, their eyes met in the reflection, and 7 years of silence stretched between them like a chasm too wide to bridge. Then she looked away, focusing on the road ahead, and Chris was left to contemplate the wreckage of his carefully constructed world. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, streaking the windows like tears. And Chris Rose realized that losing his fortune might be the least of his problems. Chapter 2. The Shock. Some ghosts refuse to stay buried, and the most dangerous ones are the ones that look exactly like the life you threw away. The Honda's engine coughed and wheezed as Asha navigated through Manhattan traffic, each struggle of the aging vehicle a reminder of how far she'd fallen from the penthouse life she'd once shared with the man now sitting in stunned silence beside her. The irony was suffocating. Her ex-husband, the great Chris Rose, reduced to riding in her beat-up Uber while their son lay sick in the back seat, unaware that his entire world was about to shift on its axis. Chris stared straight ahead, his jaw working silently, as if he were chewing words too bitter to swallow. Asha caught glimpses of him in her peripheral vision, still handsome, still carrying himself with that unconscious arrogance that had first attracted and ultimately repelled her. His expensive suit looked out of place in her car, a designer fish gasping in the wrong aquarium. "Mama," Jewel whispered from the back seat, and Asha's heart clenched at the exhaustion in her son's voice. "Can we get some crackers? My tummy feels funny." "Soon, baby," she murmured, adjusting the rearview mirror to check on him. Jewel had been having more bad days lately. the mysterious illness that had plagued him for months, growing worse, despite the cocktail of medications they could barely afford. The specialists at Mount Sinai had been cautiously optimistic, but optimism didn't pay for treatment, and hope didn't put food on the table. Chris turned in his seat, and Asha saw the exact moment recognition fully hit him. His face went ashen, those steel-grey eyes widening as he took in every detail of Jules' features, the familiar curve of his nose, the stubborn set of his jaw even in sickness, the way his hair fell across his forehead in the same unruly cowlick that Chris had always struggled to tame. "Jesus Christ," Chris breathed, the words barely audible. Over the city noise filtering through the windows, Asha's hands tightened on the steering wheel, until her wedding ring, the simple gold band she'd never been able to bring herself to remove, bit into her flesh. "Don't," she warned, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Don't you dare!" But Chris wasn't listening. His businessman's brain, the same calculating mind that had built and destroyed fortunes, was working overtime, processing dates and possibilities. "How old is he?" "That's none of your business." "Asha, how old is he?" The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. In the back seat, Jules had dozed off, his breathing shallow but steady, the stuffed elephant rising and falling with his chest. He looked so small, so vulnerable, wrapped in that threadbare blanket that Asha had bought at a thrift store when she was 7 months pregnant and trying to prepare for a baby whose father had already signed the divorce papers. 7, she finally answered, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. "He's 7 years old." Chris did the math in seconds. His face went through a series of expressions: shock, realization, pain, and something that might have been wonder if circumstances had been different. The divorce was finalized in February 2018. January 31st, Asha corrected, remembering the date with crystal clarity. It had been snowing that day, fat flakes falling like tears from a grey sky. She'd sat in the lawyer's office, her belly round with pregnancy, signing papers that would make her officially single just as she was about to become a mother. And he was born. July 15th. The date slipped out before she could stop it. Another wound torn open, 3.5 weeks early. Chris was quiet for a long moment, staring at Jules' sleeping form with an expression that Asha couldn't quite read. When he spoke again, his voice was different, softer, more uncertain than she'd ever heard it. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question detonated in the small space of the car like a grenade. 7 years of anger, hurt, and desperate loneliness came rushing back in a tide that threatened to drown her. Asha pulled over to the side of the road, ignoring the honking horns of irritated drivers, and turned to face him fully for the first time since he'd gotten in her car. "Tell you?" she repeated, her voice rising despite her efforts to keep quiet for Jules' sake. "Tell you? I tried to tell you, Chris. I called you 17 times. I sent emails. I even showed up at your office, and your security threw me out like some kind of stalker. I never got any. Bullshit." The word exploded out of her with years of pent-up fury. "You got them all. You just didn't care enough to listen. You were too busy being the victim, too busy telling everyone who would listen how I'd betrayed you, how I'd broken your heart. You never once asked yourself why I might have been so desperate to talk to you." Chris flinched, as if she'd slapped him. "The prenup investigation was a lie," Asha finished. "I never cheated on you, Chris. I never took a penny that wasn't rightfully mine. I never did any of the things you accused me of. But you chose to believe the worst because it was easier than admitting you'd been wrong." In the back seat, Jules stirred, making a small sound of distress. Asha immediately softened her voice, reaching back to smooth his hair. "It's okay, baby. Mama's here." Chris watched this tender gesture with something approaching awe. When Asha looked at their son, and Chris was no longer in denial about that relationship, her entire face transformed. The hard edges softened, the defensive walls crumbled, and for a moment she looked like the woman he'd fallen in love with at that charity gala 9 years ago. "He's sick," Chris observed, his voice gentle, Brilliant deduction. Asha's sarcasm was a shield, protecting herself from the vulnerability she'd shown. That's why we're going to the hospital, instead of your precious Meridian building. What's wrong with him? Asha was quiet for a long moment, debating whether to answer. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. They don't know yet. Some kind of blood disorder. His immune system is compromised, and he gets these episodes where he can barely breathe. The doctors are running more tests, but what? Tests cost money. Treatment costs money. Everything costs money. And I'm driving a fucking Uber to pay for his medications. The words came out bitter and raw. 7 years of struggle condensed into a single sentence. Chris looked at her then, really looked, and saw what his self-absorbed grief had blinded him to 7 years ago. The woman sitting beside him wasn't the gold digger his lawyers had painted her as. She was a mother fighting for her child's life, working herself to exhaustion to provide for a son who shared his DNA. "Let me help," he said quietly. The response was immediate and violent. "Go to hell, Asha! No." She started the car again, her movements sharp and angry. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to waltz back into our lives and play the hero now. We've managed without you for 7 years. We don't need your money or your guilt or whatever this is." She pulled back into traffic with more force than necessary, the Honda's engine protesting. In the back seat, Jewel woke up, his eyes immediately finding Chris's in the rearview mirror. For a moment, father and son looked at each other across 7 years of separation, and something passed between them, recognition maybe, or just the simple connection of shared features. "Who's the man, Mama?" Jewel asked, his voice hoarse but curious. Asha's breath caught in her throat. Chris leaned forward slightly, waiting for her answer, but she remained stubbornly silent. "How do you explain to a 7-year-old that the stranger in the front seat is the father who never knew he existed? How do you summarize years of hurt and abandonment and still bleeding wounds?" Chris began, then stopped, looking to Asha for guidance that didn't come. "He's nobody, baby," Asha finally said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Just a passenger. Go back to sleep." But Jewel was more observant than either adult gave him credit for. Even through his illness-induced fog, he could sense the tension crackling between the two grown-ups, could see the way they looked at each other when they thought he wasn't watching. He settled back against his blanket, but his eyes remained alert, watching, learning. The hospital came into view, its imposing glass facade reflecting the grey afternoon sky. Asha navigated toward the patient drop-off area, her movements automatic after months of routine. This place had become as familiar as home, more familiar perhaps, since they spent more time here than in their tiny studio apartment. As they pulled up to the curb, Chris finally found his voice again. "What's his name?" Asha hesitated, her hand on the gear shift. Jewel Rose?" The question was barely a whisper, but it hit Asha like a physical blow. She closed her eyes, remembering the night she'd given birth. Alone, scared, and still hoping against hope that Chris would somehow appear at the last moment. The nurse had asked for the father's name for the birth certificate, and Asha had whispered Chris Rose through her tears, unable to let go of the dream that they might somehow still be a family. "Williams," she lied. "His name is Jewel Williams." But Chris wasn't fooled. He could see the truth in her eyes, in the way she couldn't quite meet his gaze. As Asha helped Jewel out of the back seat, Chris caught a glimpse of the boy's medical bracelet, and there it was in tiny printed letters. Jewel Rose. The weight of 7 lost years crashed down on him like a building collapsing. Chapter 3. Silent Suffering. The cruelest prison is the one built from words left unsaid. And the most unforgivable crime is abandoning someone who needed you to stay. The hospital's automatic doors slid open with a mechanical whisper, revealing the sterile world that had become Jewel's second home. The familiar cocktail of disinfectant and floor wax hit Chris like a slap, sharp and medicinal, a smell that spoke of life and death decisions made in fluorescent-lit corridors. Asha moved through the space with practiced efficiency, one arm supporting Jules' fragile frame, while the other clutched a worn manila folder, thick with medical documents and insurance forms. Chris followed them inside, his Italian leather shoes clicking against polished linoleum that had witnessed countless tears, prayers, and miracles. He felt out of place here among the worried families and exhausted medical staff, his expensive suit marking him as an intruder in a world where money mattered less than hope and love mattered more than anything. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Williams," called a nurse from behind the reception desk, her voice carrying the kind of forced cheer that healthcare workers perfected over years of seeing too much pain. "How's our Jewel today?" "Tired," Asha replied, helping Jewel into a wheelchair that seemed too large for his small body. "The breathing episodes are getting worse, and he hasn't kept much food down since yesterday." Chris watched this exchange with growing horror and fascination. There was a routine here, a rhythm of suffering that spoke to months, maybe years, of regular visits. Jewel submitted to the wheelchair with the resigned patience of a child who had learned to accept help without complaint. His stuffed elephant clutched protectively against his chest. "Dr. Martinez is running behind schedule," the nurse continued, consulting her computer screen. "It might be about an hour wait. You know the drill. Room 3 has the good magazines and the fish tank." Asha nodded and began pushing the wheelchair down a corridor painted in supposedly calming shades of green and yellow. Chris trailed behind them like a lost shadow, his mind reeling with questions he didn't know how to ask. The pediatric wing was decorated with cartoon characters and inspirational posters, bright attempts to disguise the fact that children came here to confront mortality in ways no child should have to face. Room 3 was exactly what the nurse had promised. A waiting area with faded magazines, a large saltwater aquarium, and plastic chairs arranged in cheerful clusters that did nothing to disguise their essential function as places where people waited for news that could change everything. Asha positioned Jules' wheelchair near the fish tank, knowing from experience that the tropical fish would hold his attention and provide a distraction from his discomfort. "Look, baby," she murmured, pointing to a bright yellow tang darting between coral formations. "Your favorite is still there." Jewel managed a weak smile, pressing his palm against the glass. "He's gotten bigger since last week." The casual reference to last week hit Chris like a physical blow. This wasn't a first visit, or even an occasional occurrence. This was their life. Weekly trips to the hospital, waiting rooms, and medical procedures that had become as routine as grocery shopping or homework. Chris found himself studying his son with new eyes. Jewel was beautiful despite his obvious illness, with those unmistakable Rose family features softened by Asha's warmer coloring. His skin held a greyish undertone that spoke of poor circulation, and his breathing remained slightly laboured even at rest. But there was something else there too, a quiet strength, a dignity in the way he handled his suffering that reminded Chris painfully of Asha during their worst fights. "Mama," Jewel said quietly, not taking his eyes off the fish tank, "I'm hungry, but my stomach feels weird." Asha reached into her purse and pulled out a sleeve of saltine crackers, the kind that cost 50 cents at the vending machine. "Try just a little bit, okay? We don't want to upset your tummy before you see Dr. Martinez." Chris watched Jewel nibble carefully at a cracker, his small face serious with concentration. The sight of his son, God, his son, trying so hard to be good, to not be a burden, to manage an adult problem with the limited tools of childhood, broke something inside Chris's chest that he hadn't known was still whole. "Let me get him something better," Chris said, standing abruptly. "There's a cafeteria, right? Something with actual nutrition." "Sit down." Asha's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "He can't have anything heavy before his blood work, and we don't need your help." "But if he's hungry—" I said no. Asha's eyes flashed with a fury that made Chris step back involuntarily. "You've been gone for 7 years. You don't get to show up now and start making decisions about his care. The vehemence in her voice made Jewel look up from his crackers, his grey eyes moving between his mother and the strange man who seemed to upset her so much. Chris saw intelligence there and curiosity, but also a wariness that no 7-year-old should have to carry. "Are you fighting about me?" Jewel asked with the directness that only children possessed. "Because you sound like the parents on TV when they're getting divorced." The words hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Asha's face went white, and Chris felt something twist in his stomach. Their son was perceptive enough to recognize the dynamics of marital discord, which meant he'd probably witnessed enough of it in movies or among friends' families to make the comparison. "Nobody's fighting." "Sweetheart," Asha said quickly, though her voice remained strained. "The man is he's just a passenger who missed his stop." Chris flinched at being reduced to such casual insignificance, but he couldn't argue with Asha's version of events. What was he to Jewel, really? A stranger who happened to share his DNA? A father who had never been present for a single birthday, Christmas morning, or sleepless night of fever? "Oh," Jewel considered this explanation with the seriousness he brought to most adult conversations. "Is he lost? Mama, we should help him find where he's supposed to go." The innocence of the suggestion was devastating. Here was his son, sick and tired and dealing with more medical trauma than most adults faced in a lifetime, still thinking about helping a stranger who seemed confused. Chris felt tears prick at his eyes for the first time in years, and he had to turn toward the fish tank to compose himself. "That's very kind of you, baby," Asha said softly, and Chris could hear the pride and love in her voice. "But I think he knows where he needs to be." Did he, though? Chris stared at the tropical fish swimming in their carefully controlled environment and wondered if he had any idea where he belonged in this complex equation. An hour ago he'd been focused on saving his company, on impressing Japanese investors and salvaging his financial empire. Now watching his ex-wife comfort a son he'd never known existed, those concerns felt like problems from another lifetime. "Mama," Jewel's voice had grown weaker, and he leaned heavily against the side of his wheelchair. "The hurty feeling is coming back." Asha was beside him instantly, her hand cool against his forehead. Chris watched her transform into full maternal protection mode, every movement economical and purposeful. She pulled a small digital thermometer from her purse, clearly a permanent resident there, and took Jewel's temperature with practiced ease. 99.4, she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "Not too bad, but we should keep an eye on it." Chris found himself leaning forward unconsciously, as if proximity could somehow help. "Is that normal?" "The fever?" Asha shot him a look that could have frozen fire. "What do you think?" "Yes, it's completely normal for 7-year-olds to run fevers while waiting to see specialists about mysterious blood disorders. Happens all the time." The sarcasm was acidic, but Chris could hear the fear underneath it. This was a woman who had been fighting for her child's health alone for months, maybe longer, and every symptom was a source of terror she couldn't share with anyone. "I didn't mean," Chris began, but Jewel interrupted him. "Mama, why are you being mean to the nice man?" The question was asked with genuine confusion. "He just asked a question like Dr. Martinez does." Asha's expression softened immediately when she looked at Jewel, but her voice remained firm. "Sometimes adults have complicated feelings, baby. It doesn't mean anyone is bad." Jewel nodded, as if this made perfect sense, which perhaps it did in the simplified moral universe that children inhabited. Chris envied that clarity, that ability to accept complex emotions without needing to understand all their sources and implications. A commotion in the hallway drew their attention. Another family arriving in crisis. Medical staff moving with urgent purpose. The controlled chaos that marked genuine emergency. Chris watched Asha tense, her maternal instincts on high alert even for other people's children, and realized that this woman lived in a state of constant vigilance he could barely imagine. "How long has he been sick?" Chris asked quietly. Asha was silent for so long that he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Really sick? About 6 months. But there have been smaller things for years. Getting tired easily, catching every bug that went around, bruising that took forever to heal. I kept thinking it was just normal kid stuff, you know. Single mom paranoia. The guilt in her voice was palpable, and Chris recognized it because he'd carried similar weight for different reasons. You couldn't have known, couldn't I? She turned to look at him directly for the first time since they'd entered the hospital. Maybe if I'd had better insurance, we could have caught it earlier. Maybe if I hadn't been working 3 jobs to keep us afloat, I would have noticed the symptoms sooner. Maybe if his father had been around to help, I wouldn't have missed the signs. The accusation hung between them like a live wire. Chris wanted to defend himself, to explain about the divorce proceedings and the lawyers and the way she'd seemed to disappear from his life completely. But looking at Jewel, pale, sick, clutching his stuffed elephant while his mother fought back tears, those excuses crumbled to dust. Jewel Rose Williams, a voice called from the doorway, and they all turned to see a young medical assistant with a clipboard and a kind smile. "Here," Asha called, immediately shifting back into crisis management mode. As they prepared to move toward the examination rooms, Jewel looked back at Chris one more time. "Are you coming too, mister?" The question was innocent, curious, without any of the complex emotional baggage that his parents carried. To Jewel, this was simply a man who had seemed interested in his welfare, and it was natural to assume that interest might extend to medical visits. Chris looked to Asha, who shook her head almost imperceptibly. The message was clear. This was not his place, not his right, not his family to claim after 7 years of absence. "I need to go, buddy," Chris said, surprised by how much the words hurt to say. "But I hope you feel better soon." Jewel nodded solemnly and allowed himself to be wheeled away, leaving Chris alone in the waiting room with nothing but the sound of bubbling aquarium filters and the weight of 7 years' worth of mistakes. But as he watched them disappear down the corridor, Chris Rose made a decision that would change all their lives forever. Chapter 4. The Discovery. The truth has a way of hiding in plain sight until the moment you're finally ready to see it. And then it burns with the intensity of 7 years' worth of denied daylight. The law office of Blackstone. Hartwell and Associates occupied 3 floors of a Manhattan high-rise, its mahogany-paneled walls and Persian rugs designed to intimidate and impress. Chris Rose had spent millions in legal fees within these rooms over the years, but today he felt like a supplicant approaching an altar of judgment. His usual lawyer, Hamilton Blackstone III, sat behind a desk that could have doubled as an aircraft carrier, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the late hour. "Chris, I have to say, this request is highly unusual," Hamilton said, adjusting his gold-rimmed glasses as he reviewed the document spread before them. "You're asking me to dig into sealed divorce records, medical files, and financial documents from 7 years ago. May I ask why?" Chris stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the glittering city below. Somewhere out there, Asha was probably getting Jewel settled for the night after their hospital visit, helping him with medication, reading him stories, being the parent Chris had never learned to be. The thought made his chest tight with emotions he didn't know how to name. "I think I made a mistake," he said finally. "A big one." Hamilton's eyebrows rose slightly. In 15 years of representing Chris Rose, he'd never heard the man admit to error. "What kind of mistake?" "The kind that cost me my son." The words hung in the air between them like a confession at trial. Hamilton set down his pen and leaned back in his leather chair, studying Chris with the calculating gaze that made him one of New York's most feared divorce attorneys. "Chris, the divorce was finalized in 2018. Asha Williams signed a comprehensive settlement agreement. There was no mention of any children, no custody arrangements, no child support provisions. If there had been a pregnancy, our investigators would have..." Your investigators were looking for infidelity and hidden assets, Chris interrupted, his voice rough with exhaustion and regret. They weren't looking for medical records or hospital visits or birth certificates. Hamilton was quiet for a long moment, processing this new information. Are you telling me that Asha was pregnant during your divorce proceedings? Chris pulled out his phone and showed Hamilton a photo he'd taken surreptitiously at the hospital, Jewel asleep in his wheelchair, the medical bracelet clearly visible on his thin wrist. His name is Jewel Rose. He's 7 years old. Do the math. Hamilton studied the image with the attention to detail that had made him rich. Chris could see the exact moment recognition dawned, when the familiar Rose family features became undeniable. Jesus Christ, Chris. He looks exactly like you did at that age. I need everything, Chris said, his voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside his chest. Hospital records, birth certificate, medical bills, school enrollment forms, everything that proves what I should have known 7 years ago. Hamilton reached for his phone. This is going to take time. Medical records are sealed and hospital privacy laws. I don't care what it costs or what laws you have to dance around. I need to know what happened, and I need to know tonight. 3 hours later, Chris sat in his empty penthouse apartment, surrounded by documents that painted a picture of betrayal so complete it took his breath away. Not Asha's betrayal, his own. Every page was another knife twist, another moment of clarity about the magnitude of his mistakes. The birth certificate was dated July 15th, 2018. Father, Christopher James Rose. Mother, Asha Marie Williams. The baby had been born at Mount Sinai Hospital after a difficult labor complicated by stress and poor prenatal care. Asha had been alone. No family, no husband, no support system beyond the nursing staff who had held her hand through 13 hours of contractions. The hospital billing records were even more damning. Asha had been carried as an emergency admission, her insurance insufficient to cover the costs of premature labor. The total bill had been over $40,000. She'd set up a payment plan, $500 per month for the next 8 years. A crushing financial burden for a woman whose husband had just divorced her and whose career prospects had been destroyed by the same legal proceedings, but it was the phone. Records that broke Chris's heart completely. Hamilton had somehow obtained the call logs from Chris's office phone system during the final months of their marriage. There they were, clear as day, 17. Calls from Asha's cell phone between December 2017 and March 2018. The longest had lasted less than 30 seconds, just long enough for his secretary to inform the caller that Mr. Rose was not available and would not be returning the call. The email logs were worse. Asha had sent message after message to his personal and business accounts. Subject lines growing increasingly desperate. Please call me back. It's important. We need to talk about the baby. That last one was dated February 14th, 2018. Valentine's Day. She'd tried to tell him about their son on Valentine's Day, and his security system had automatically deleted the message as spam from a blocked sender. Chris poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey from the bottle he kept for special occasions and disasters. This qualified as both. The apartment felt cavernous around him, 40 floors above the city where his family lived, in circumstances he was only beginning to understand. He pulled up Asha's current address from the private investigator's report Hamilton had commissioned. A studio apartment in Queens, monthly rent $800, shared bathroom down the hall. The building had been cited multiple times for heating violations and pest control issues. This was where his son was growing up, in a place Chris wouldn't have housed his car. The medical records were the final straw. Jewel's health issues hadn't started recently. There were emergency room visits going back years, pediatric consultations, specialist appointments that Asha had somehow managed to afford through a combination of Medicaid, charity programs, and payment plans that would take her decades to complete. The most recent diagnosis was tentative but terrifying: possible juvenile myelofibrosis, a rare blood disorder that could be fatal without proper treatment. The recommended treatment plan made Chris's blood run cold. Bone marrow biopsy, chemotherapy, possible transplant surgery. The estimated cost ran into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, money Asher clearly didn't have and never would have, driving for Uber and working part-time jobs. Chris set down his whiskey glass with shaking hands and reached for his phone. He needed to see them again, needed to talk to Asha, needed to figure out how to undo 7 years of catastrophic mistakes. But when he tried to call the number from her Uber profile, it went straight to voicemail. "This is Asha, leave a message." Her voice was different than he remembered, harder, more guarded, worn down by years of carrying burdens that should have been shared. Chris tried to find words that could bridge the gap between what had been and what might still be possible. "Asha, it's Chris. I know you don't want to hear from me, but I've seen the medical records. I know about Jules' condition, and I know about the bills. I know what I did wrong, and I know it's probably too late to fix it, but I want to try. I want to help. Please call me back." He hung up and immediately called again, this time leaving a different message. "It's Chris again. I know you're screening your calls. I know you have every right to hate me. But Jules is sick and he needs treatment we can afford together, but you can't afford alone. I'm not trying to buy my way back into your lives. I'm trying to do what I should have done 7 years ago, please." The third message was simpler. "I love you, both of you. I know I don't have the right to say that anymore, but it's true. It's always been true." Chris spent the rest of the night researching juvenile myelofibrosis, reading medical journals and treatment protocols, until his eyes burned with exhaustion. The survival rates were good with proper care, excellent even. But the key word was proper. Asha couldn't provide proper care on her own, and their son would suffer for his father's pride and blindness. Dawn was breaking over Manhattan when Chris finally fell asleep on his leather couch, surrounded by documents that told the story of everything he'd lost and everything he might never get back. His last conscious thought was of Jules' grey eyes, looking at him with curiosity instead of condemnation, and the way the boy had asked if they were fighting about him. Because they were, in a way. They were fighting about love and responsibility and second chances, and whether 7 years of absence could be forgiven in the face of a child's need. They were fighting about whether Chris Rose deserved the chance to be the father he'd never learned to be, and whether Asha Williams had the strength to trust the man who'd already broken her heart once. But mostly they were fighting against time, because Jules Rose needed treatment, and every day they spent in anger and recrimination was another day closer to the point where forgiveness might not matter anymore. Chapter 5. The Confrontation. Some conversations can only happen when pride finally steps aside to make room for truth. But by then, the words carry the weight of everything that should have been said years ago. The October morning arrived grey and bitter. New York City, wrapped in fog that made the towering buildings look like monuments to lost dreams. Chris Rose sat in the back of a black sedan outside Mount Sinai Hospital, watching the patient drop-off area through tinted windows that felt like a barrier between him and the life he'd abandoned. He'd been there since 6 in the morning, waiting with the obsessive patience of a man who had nowhere else to be and everything to lose. At 7:30, he saw them. Asha's battered Honda pulled up to the curb, exhaust pipe coughing like an old man's last breath. She moved around to the passenger side with practiced efficiency, helping Jules out of his booster seat with the gentle care of someone who understood that every movement might cause pain. The boy looked worse than he had the day before, paler, more fragile, like a piece of antique glass that might shatter at the wrong touch. Chris waited until they'd entered the hospital before following, his heart hammering against his ribs with the irregular rhythm of a man walking toward his own judgment day. The pediatric wing was already busy, despite the early hour. A parade of worried parents and sick children that reminded him how many battles were being fought in rooms, just like this one, all over the world. He found them in room 3 again, Jewel positioned near the fish tank while Asha filled out paperwork with the weary resignation of someone who'd completed these forms countless times before. She looked up when Chris entered, and he saw her entire body tense like a deer sensing a predator. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was sharp enough to cut, but Chris could hear the exhaustion underneath the anger. "I know," he said simply, pulling a manila folder from his briefcase and setting it on the small table beside her chair. "I know everything." Asha glanced at the folder, then back at his face, searching for deception or manipulation or any of the games that had characterized the end of their marriage. Whatever she saw there made her shoulders slump slightly, as if she'd been holding her breath for 7 years and could finally exhale. "And?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew what he'd discovered. Chris looked at Jewel, who was watching the fish with the determined concentration of a child trying not to listen to adult conversations that were clearly about him. "Can we talk privately?" "No." Asha's response was immediate and firm. "Whatever you have to say, you can say it here. I'm not leaving him alone, and I'm not going anywhere with you." The rejection stung, but Chris understood it. Trust, once broken, didn't regenerate just because the breaking had been based on misunderstandings. He pulled up a plastic chair and sat down carefully, as if sudden movements might spook her into running. "I saw the birth certificate," he said quietly. "The hospital bills, the phone records, all of it." Asha's hands stilled on the insurance forms, her knuckles going white as she gripped the pen. And I know what I did. I know how badly I failed both of you." Chris's voice was steady, but Asha could see the tremor in his hands. "I know you tried to tell me, and I know I was too proud and too stupid and too convinced of my own righteousness to listen." "Congratulations," Asha said, her tone flat. "You figured it out 7 years too late. I want to help. With what?" Chris gestured toward Jewel, who had abandoned his fish-watching to listen to their conversation with the frank curiosity that only children possessed. "His medical bills, his treatment, whatever he needs. We don't need your money. Asha, he has juvenile myelofibrosis. Do you have any idea what the treatment costs?" The medical term hung in the air between them, like a death sentence. Asha's carefully constructed composure cracked slightly, and Chris saw the fear she'd been hiding behind anger and pride. "How do you know that?" she whispered. "Because I spent all night researching it after I saw his medical records. Because I know you've been carrying this alone for months, and I know the recommended treatment protocol costs more than you make in 5 years. Tears gathered in Asha's eyes, but she blinked them back with fierce determination. "We're managing. You're drowning," Chris said gently, "and our son is getting sicker while you try to manage." "Mama?" Jewel's voice was small and uncertain. "Are you crying?" Asha immediately shifted her attention to him, smoothing his hair with shaking hands. "No, baby, Mama's just tired." But Jewel was observant enough to see through the lie. His grey eyes, so like his father's, moved between his mother and the stranger who seemed to know things about his sickness that made his mama sad. "Are you a doctor?" Jewel asked Chris directly. "No," Chris replied, his voice gentle. "I'm not a doctor. Then how do you know about my sick blood?" The question was asked with the directness that only children could manage, cutting through layers of adult complexity to reach the heart of the matter. Chris looked to Asha, silently asking for permission to answer honestly. "Tell him," she said quietly, her voice heavy with defeat and resignation. Chris knelt down beside Jewel's wheelchair, bringing himself to the boy's eye level. Up close, the resemblance was even more striking. The same stubborn chin, the same slight cleft that Chris had inherited from his own father, the same way of tilting his head when concentrating. "I know about your sickness because I care about you," Chris said carefully, "and I know about it because your mama tried very hard to tell me about you when you were born, but I wasn't listening the way I should have been. Jewel considered this explanation with the seriousness he brought to most adult conversations. Why weren't you listening? They did because sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, big ones, and sometimes they're too proud to admit they were wrong until it's almost too late. Are you my daddy? The question detonated in the small waiting room like a grenade. Asha made a small sound of distress, her hand covering her mouth. Chris felt the weight of 7 years pressing down on him like a physical force. Yes, he said simply. I am. Jewel nodded as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. I thought so. I look like you. Yes, you do. Where have you been? The innocent question was devastating in its simplicity. Where had he been while Jewel learned to walk, said his first words, started school, got sick? Where had he been during birthday parties and Christmas mornings and middle-of-the-night fever scares? I was being stupid, Chris said honestly. And I'm very, very sorry about that. Jewel absorbed this information with the philosophical acceptance that children often brought to adult failings. Are you going to help me get better? And I'm going to try, Chris promised. If your mama will let me. All eyes turned to Asha, who sat frozen in her plastic chair like a woman caught between competing storms. On one side was her pride, her anger, her justified fury at 7 years of abandonment. On the other was her love for Jewel, her fear for his health, her desperate need for the resources that could save his life. The bone marrow biopsy is scheduled for next week, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The insurance will cover 60%. The rest, I'll pay for it, Chris said immediately. All of it, whatever he needs. And then what? Asha's voice rose slightly, drawing concerned glances from other families in the waiting room. You write a check, ease your conscience, and disappear again. You think money fixes 7 years of absence? No, Chris said quietly. I think money fixes medical bills. Everything else is going to take a lot longer. We don't need you, Asha said, but the words lacked conviction. They both knew she was lying. Maybe you don't, Chris acknowledged. But he does. And whether you hate me or not, whether you forgive me or not, Jewel needs treatment that you can't afford alone. The truth of this statement settled between them like a weight neither could lift alone. In the silence that followed, they could hear the aquarium filters bubbling, the soft conversations of other worried families, the distant sound of medical equipment that kept children alive one day at a time. Mama, Jewel said quietly, I don't want to be sick anymore. The simple statement broke what remained of Asha's resistance. She looked at her son, pale, tired, fighting a battle he shouldn't have to fight, and made the hardest decision of her life. Okay, she whispered. Okay. Chris felt something ease in his chest, a tightness he'd been carrying since the moment he'd seen them in the hospital the day before. It wasn't forgiveness, wasn't reconciliation, wasn't anything close to redemption. But it was a beginning, a chance to prove that 7 years of mistakes didn't have to define the rest of their lives. Jewel rose, called a medical assistant from the doorway, clipboard in hand, and kind smile in place. As they prepared to move toward the examination rooms, Jewel reached out and took Chris's hand with the casual trust that children offered to adults who seemed safe. His small fingers were cold and thin, but his grip was surprisingly strong. Will you stay this time? He asked, looking up at his father with eyes that held no accusation, only hope. Chris squeezed the small hand gently, feeling the weight of a promise that would change everything. Yes, he said, I'll stay. But as they walked down the hospital corridor together, father, mother, and son, finally in the same place at the same time, none of them could have predicted that staying would require more courage than leaving ever had, or that the real battle for their family was only just beginning. From the nurse's station, an alarm began to sound, and Chris Rose learned that some fights couldn't be won with money, pride, or good intentions. Some fights could only be won with love, and he was 7 years behind in learning what that really meant. Wait, the story isn't over yet. A beautiful part 2 will be uploaded in just a few hours. If you want to watch part 2, make sure to like this video, comment part 2, and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell. God bless you, and bye until the next video. Have a wonderful day.